I want to say that I haven't been to Cairo for some time, and certainly not since the revolution. And I think it's clear to me, and probably to everyone else who's come since then, the passion and the excitement and the euphoria that's in the air here is so palpable, it's so overwhelming, that I know you all feel it, but I don't think you see it the way we see it. And in fact, I've been so overwhelmed by this that I want to tell you that these feelings were shared by those of us who were not necessarily in Medan al-Tahrir or in Cairo or even in Egypt or in Tunis. Those of us sitting in Beirut, for instance, were constantly watching television, except when we had no electricity, which was most of the time. But so when I was first asked to come to this conference, I worried a lot about it, narrating the Arab Spring. I thought, who am I to narrate something for someone else? And I thought a lot about the whole business of who gets to narrate stories. It raised with me another question. Well, first of all, there's been so much written that one asks oneself, is there anything left to say? I'm not sure there is, but British. The question is, are Tunisians and Egyptians the only ones who are allowed to speak about their experiences? Or if someone comes from the outside, is he or she allowed to add something? Or would that be considered an illegitimate sort of thing? I just want to tell you that Beirutis keep a proprietary and a very cautious and wary eye out on events in the Arab world. I don't know if you know the expression, كل ما غيمت في البلاد العربية بتشتي ببيروت. I don't know if you know this. أو حبلت في البلاد العربية ولدت في بيروت. So we're very careful, we're carefully watching what you're up to here, so that, because sooner or later we feel we're going to somehow pay the price for your, whatever you do, good or bad. So I feel as a Beiruti, I can maybe say, and of course as a Cairo lover, as a Cairene, as someone who grew up in this wonderful city, I sound like an American politician, they're always saying about our great nation. But anyway, I love Cairo with all my heart, and I was with you every minute of the Medan al-Tahrir experience, though from a safe distance, I might add. So if you will allow me, from the point of view of someone from outside who's also, I think, inside in some ways, I'm very worried about the phrase the Arab Spring. Because I feel, first of all, the Arab Spring, I mean, Radwa Ashur the first day said this came from, so I don't care who invented it, that's not my problem. My problem is the spring, the imagery of the spring, which may have had some legitimacy in the heady early days of euphoria, when Ben Ali went and then Mubarak went, and it was springtime and so on. But how does spring apply to Yemen? How does spring apply to Bahrain? How does spring apply to Libya? How does spring apply now to Syria? These are not spring images. This is not Sham al-Nasim and roses. This is something awful that's happening. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about our use of this phrase. Also, the spring calls to mind the Prague Spring of 1968 and the Damascus Spring of 2000, all of which ended not very nicely. So we shouldn't sort of... I'm very superstitious, and I don't know. Also the phrase, the Arab, but if we don't use the word the Arab Spring, then what do we say? The Arab Revolution, Dr. Lubna Yusuf was adamant in the opening. This is a revolution and not an uprising. If it is a revolution, which I'll take your word for, I'm not sure, I think we have to think a little bit more. As I was preparing for this presentation, I was reading a lot about revolutions. I kept coming across a phrase from Lenin, who said in What's to be Done in 1902, he said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And I understand now that theorizing is happening, but I'm not sure whether, it seems to me that much of what has happened has been sort of action-oriented rather than, and I think we just need to think about that. But if we say intifada or revolt, the Arab revolt sounds like 1916, which also didn't end very well also. I want to come back to the question of ownership. Who gets to tell the story, first of all? And second of all, do we assume that whoever was actively involved in something actually knows more about it than someone who was not inside it? There's a wonderful passage in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution where he compares Nicholas II at the end of his days, by using his diaries and letters and speeches and so on, Nicholas II with Charles I of England and Louis XVI of France. And he shows how each of them, just on the brink of collapse, hadn't a clue what was happening. I mean, they simply hadn't a clue. They just didn't understand what was happening. I'm not suggesting by any means that you are in that position at all, but certainly Mubarak was, and certainly Ben Ali was, and certainly Gaddafi was, and so on. I think we need to think a little bit about these things. I'm going to come back to these three gentlemen and the others like them in a little while. There's something about stealing narratives that I want to talk about. And what does it mean to steal someone's narrative? Is it possible to steal? And what does it mean? I don't know how many of you, especially those who teach literature, remember the story of William Styron, the American writer, who wrote a novel in the 1960s called The Confessions of Nat Turner. I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's a magnificent book. William Styron was a white writer from the south of the United States. And we're talking about the 1960s when the great American black civil rights movement was at its peak. The story of Nat Turner, this is a historical novel. Nat Turner was a real man. He was a slave who led a slave rebellion against the white plantation owners and led a group of former slaves, I don't know what you want to call them, and murdered a lot of white people. They actually went into people's houses, cut their throats, and were extremely violent, and it's a very... But of course, William Styron shows you a rather sympathetic picture of Nat Turner, not of course defending his violence or anything like that, but showing where it came from. Really a wonderful historical novel. Well, at the time, the people of the black movement were extremely angry. And they said, you have stolen our story. This is a story that we have to tell. And poor Styron was really put in a very difficult position because he said at the time, and I remember I've been trying to find documentation of all of this, but I will eventually. He was saying, but this is a universal story. And this is a story about rebelling against slavery. And it's my story as much as it's your story or anyone else's story, because we're all against slavery and so on. I think it's a very interesting question to ask ourselves, because I have some sympathy with Styron, but I also have some sympathy with the blacks who got angry and who said, this is our story and you're stealing it. At least William Styron in his novel he doesn't abuse his position as a writer. On the contrary, he's very sympathetic to the revolt. And I don't know if a black writer would have done it any better, but perhaps he would. But I understand there. When it comes to there are other kinds of stealing narratives which are quite different and which are extremely mischievous. And I'd like to just remind you, in case you need reminding, which I'm sure you do, the Palestinian narrative, which we all know and which, I mean, we all know about how that narrative or the story of Palestine has been usurped and things. I'm just going to give one example because it happened very recently and it's so unbelievable, you have to hear it in case you haven't. That came out of the television debates going on in the United States right now, the Republican presidential debate. You know, of course, that Gingrich had said the Palestinians are an invented people. So, and this came after. This is the January 27th debate, and I swear, you're not going to believe it, but I swear it's on YouTube, you can look it up and see it for yourself.